All right, let's dive into some ancient history today.
Mm.
The Persian Wars. The clash of civilizations that everyone's heard of, but maybe hasn't really explored beyond the 300 movie version.
Yeah, exactly. We've got some excerpts from a text that really get into the battles, strategies, and how the Greeks, against all odds, managed to hold off what seemed like an unstoppable force.
A real underdog story.
Yeah.
But first, I think we got to kind of set the stage here. So we're talking the 400s BCE, and the Persian Empire is massive, stretching all the way from Egypt to modern-day Pakistan.
Yeah, and it's hard to overstate how powerful they were. I mean, their military, especially those archers everyone's heard about, they had conquered just huge swaths of land. And their king Darius, he wasn't just a military leader, he was a brilliant administrator. He divided this vast empire into 20 provinces, set up a tax system, appointed local rulers. Talk about organizational skills.
I mean, with all that conquering,
Yeah.
you'd think they'd be forcing their culture on everyone. But our text mentions something kind of interesting. The Persians were actually pretty tolerant for the time. Conquered people got to keep their own customs and religions.
Yeah. Which is fascinating when you think about it. This empire built on military might, but internally, a surprising degree of cultural freedom. It makes you wonder how that impacted their stability and ultimately their war with the Greeks.
Right, because that tolerance didn't extend to taxes and military service, which is what kind of sparked the whole conflict. The Ionian Greek settlements over on the Aegean coast, they weren't exactly thrilled about being under Persian rule.
Imagine being a proud, independent people, and suddenly you have to pay tribute and send your sons off to fight for a foreign empire resentment was bound to build.
And build it did, culminating in the Ionian Revolt in 499 BCE, now Athens. They initially sided with the Ionians, but then they pulled back, leaving the Ionians vulnerable.
That was a decision. That would have major consequences. Darius wasn't about to let this rebellion slide. He crushed it. And to send a message, he completely destroyed the city of Miletus.
Brutal. I can't imagine the impact that must have had on the Greeks. Seeing a major city just wiped out like that definitely set the stage for all-out war.
Oh, yeah. And it personally offended Darius. The Greeks had refused to submit to his rule before, and now this. He was determined to teach them a lesson.
Which brings us to 490 BCE and the Battle of Marathon. Darius sends his army across the Aegean, landing just outside Athens. You have to wonder what was going through the minds of the Athenians, seeing this massive force right on their doorstep.
Well, they had one thing the Persians didn't expect. A brilliant general named Miltiades. He knew the Athenians couldn't just sit back and wait. They were outnumbered, but they had to strike back.
And they had a secret weapon, right? Better equipment. Our text mentions the Greeks had superior weapons and armor, specifically designed for close combat.
Exactly. And Miltiades was a master strategist. He used a flanking maneuver, drawing the Persians in with what looked like a retreat in the center, then hitting them from both sides.
Hold on. Can we break down that flanking maneuver for a second? I'm picturing it in my head, but I bet our listener would appreciate a clearer visual.
So imagine the Persian forces advancing in a line. Miltiades intentionally weakens his center, making it seem like the Greeks are falling back. The Persians seeing an opening, they push forward, they bunch up, and that's when the Greek forces, hidden on the flanks, spring their trap, attacking the Persian sides, where they're most vulnerable.
Oh, wow. Like a pincer move. The Persians wouldn't have known what hit them.
Exactly. And the casualties speak for themselves. The Persians lost over 6,000 men, while the Greeks lost less than 200. It was a devastating defeat for Darius, and a huge victory for the Greeks.
But, as we know, this is just the beginning of the story. Darius may have been defeated, but his son Xerxes, well, he was a whole other story.
Yeah. Let's just say that the defeat at Marathon did not sit well with Xerxes. He vowed revenge and began to assemble an even larger army, determined to finish what his father started. This was about more than just conquering Greece. It was personal.
So last we left off, Xerxes was fuming. After his father's defeat at Marathon, he was determined to avenge Darius and conquer Greece once and for all. But how do you top an army the size of Darius's?
Well, if you're Xerxes, you go bigger. He spent years building up his forces, creating an army even more massive than his father's, and to get them across the Hellespont, that narrow strait, separating Europe from Asia. He did something pretty remarkable.
Wait, I'm looking at our text here. He built a bridge. Out of boats?
A bridge and boats. It's mind-boggling when you think about it. They lashed together hundreds of boats, covered them with planks, and created this pathway for his army and chariots to march across. I mean, talk about a logistical feat.
That's incredible. It just gives you a sense of the resources and the manpower the Persian Empire had at its disposal.
Yeah.
It must have been a sight to behold. this massive army crossing the sea on a bridge of boats. It makes you want to root for the underdog even more, doesn't it?
Definitely. But facing this colossal threat, the Greeks knew they had to put aside their differences. Athens and Sparta, historical rivals, formed an alliance. Their survival depended on it.
Talk about putting aside your ego for the greater good. It just shows you the gravity of the situation. So where did they decide to make their stand against Xerxes and his massive army?
The Spartans, known for their warrior culture and discipline, they chose Thermopylae, a narrow mountain pass. It was a strategic choke point, limiting the Persians' numerical advantage.
So they were trying to level the playing field, it makes sense, using the terrain to their advantage. And leading the Spartans was King Leonidas, right? With his legendary 300 warriors.
That's right. Now, we've all heard the stories about the 300 Spartans, and it's easy to get caught up in the heroism. But let's think about it strategically for a moment. Why do you think Leonidas chose to make his stand with such a small force?
Well, on the surface, it seems crazy, right? 300 men against a massive Persian army. But maybe Leonidas was playing a different game. Was he hoping to inflict as many casualties as possible on the Persians to demoralize them, even if it meant sacrificing himself and his men?
That's a very astute observation. And you're right, the Spartans inflicted heavy losses on the Persians. In those first few days of fighting, they held the pass, repelling wave after wave of attacks. The Persians were accustomed to overwhelming their opponents with sheer numbers. So the Spartans' fierce resistance must have come as a shock.
I bet it did. But we know the Spartans ultimately couldn't hold Thermopylae. What happened? How did the Persians break through?
Well, a Greek trader revealed a secret path through the mountains, allowing the Persians to outflank the Spartans. Trapped and facing certain death, Leonidas made a difficult choice. He ordered most of his remaining troops to retreat, while he and the 300 stayed behind to hold off the Persians and buy time for the Greek army to escape.
That's incredibly brave. Must have been a tough decision, knowing he was sending his men to their deaths, but also understanding the strategic importance of their sacrifice. What impact did their stand ultimately have on the war?
Well, it definitely bought valuable time for the Greeks to regroup and prepare for the next phase of the conflict. And it sent a powerful message about Greek courage and determination. The Persians had won a tactical victory, but the Spartans' defiance had a psychological impact, proving that the Greeks were not easily defeated.
Okay, so the Spartans have fallen at Thermopylae, bravely holding off the Persians, but ultimately sacrificing themselves. And meanwhile, Athens is wide open. What happens next?
Faced with the advancing Persian army, the Athenians made the heartbreaking decision to abandon their city. They evacuated by sea, seeking refuge on nearby islands. It must have been a devastating experience, leaving their homes and temples behind, knowing that Xerxes would likely raze Athens to the ground.
Absolutely. But even in retreat, the Athenians weren't giving up. They still had their navy. And this is where Themistocles, the Athenian naval commander, steps onto the stage. He seems to have been just as clever a strategist as Miltiades.
Oh, absolutely. Themistocles knew that Athens' best hope lay with its navy. He understood the power of the Athenian fleet with its smaller, more maneuverable ships, and he had a plan.
A plan to take on the massive Persian fleet? That seems like a long shot.
It was a gamble for sure, but Themistocles was a master of deception. He knew that the narrow straits of Salamis would negate the Persians' numerical advantage, so he had to lure them in.
So how did he manage to do that? I mean, Xerxes wasn't exactly known for falling for tricks.
Well, according to our text, Themistocles used a bit of psychological warfare. He sent a message to Xerxes, pretending to be a defector. He claimed the Greeks were demoralized and divided, urging Xerxes to attack immediately while they were vulnerable.
Wow, a fake defector.
Yeah.
Talk about a high-stakes bluff. Did Xerxes buy it?
He did. Xerxes, eager to crush the Greeks and avenge his father, took the bait and ordered his fleet into the narrow straits of Salamis.
I bet that was exactly what Themistocles was hoping for.
It was a brilliant tactical move in the confines of the straits. The Persian ships, larger and less maneuverable, were at a significant disadvantage.
So this wasn't just about brute force. It was about using the terrain, using deception, outsmarting your opponent. I'm guessing this was another major turning point in the war.
It was. The Battle of Salamis was a decisive victory for the Greeks. Their smaller, faster ships rammed and sank hundreds of Persian vessels, inflicting a crushing defeat on Xerxes' navy. Imagine the scene. The narrow straits choked with burning ships, the air thick with smoke, and the cries of battle.
It must have been utter chaos. And for Xerxes, it must have been a humiliating defeat. All that planning, all those resources, and his grand invasion was falling apart.
Yes. The defeat at Salamis shattered Xerxes' hopes for a quick and decisive victory. He retreated back to Persia with a significant portion of his army, leaving behind a substantial force under the command of his general Mardonius.
So the war wasn't over yet. There was still a Persian army in Greece. And Mardonius, I'm guessing, wasn't going to just pack up and go home.
You're right, Xerxes might have retreated, but Mardonius was determined to salvage something from this disastrous campaign. The fate of Greece was still hanging in the balance.
So Xerxes is back in Persia after that defeat at Salamis, but he's left a pretty sizable force behind in Greece. Under Mardonius, you'd think they'd be ready to cut their losses. But this is where that Persian tenacity really shows, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Giving up just wasn't in their nature. Remember, this wasn't just about land or resources for the Persians. It was about their image, their reputation as this unstoppable force.
Right.
To just walk away would have been a huge blow to their imperial prestige.
And for the Greeks.
No.
Even after that victory at Salamis, they knew the danger wasn't over. There was still a Persian army on their soil. Did they try to negotiate at all? Or was it clear this was going to another showdown?
There were some attempts at negotiation, but ultimately both sides knew what was at stake. For the Persians, it was about saving face, proving they could still dominate. And for the Greeks, it was about securing their freedom once and for all.
So the stage is set for one final clash. Our text mentions the Battle of Plataea. In 479 BCE, was this the culmination of everything, the battle that finally decided the fate of Greece?
Yes. Plataea was a decisive battle. That effectively ended the Persian Wars. It was a massive land battle. The Greek allied forces led by the Spartans, facing off against Mardonius, and the remaining Persian army.
Knowing how the Spartans fought at Thermopylae, I can only imagine how intense this battle must have been.
It was a fierce and bloody fight, both sides showing incredible courage and determination. But in the end, the Greek alliance, with their combined forces and their strategic coordination, proved to be too strong for the Persians. Mardonius was killed, and his army was routed. It was a resounding victory for the Greeks.
What a moment that must have been. After years of conflict and fear and loss, the Greeks had finally driven back the Persian invaders and secured their independence.
Imagine the celebrations, the sense of relief and jubilation that must have swept through Greece. But it's important to remember that victory came at a high cost. Cities were in ruins, thousands were dead, and the psychological scars of war would linger for generations.
It's a good reminder that even in victory, there's always a cost, a price to be paid. But I guess that's what makes stories like this so powerful, so human. It's not just about the battles and the strategies. It's about the sacrifices people make, the resilience they show. In the face of overwhelming odds.
Exactly. And the Persian Wars weren't just some ancient conflict. That happened long ago. They had a profound impact on the course of Western civilization. The Greeks' victory paved the way for the rise of Athenian democracy, the flourishing of art and philosophy, and the development of ideas that would shape Western thought for centuries to come. Imagine if the Persians had won. Would we have the same concept of democracy today? Would philosophy and science have developed the same way? It's fascinating to consider the ripple effects of these ancient events.
It really is. We started this deep dive talking about an underdog story. And that's exactly what it was. The Greeks, facing an empire that seemed invincible, managed to hold on, to fight back, and ultimately to triumph. It's a testament to their courage, their ingenuity, and their unwavering belief in their way of life.
And it leaves us with so much to think about. How did these wars shape not just the ancient world, but our world today? How do the echoes of these ancient conflicts resonate in modern geopolitics, in our ideas about freedom and democracy? These are questions that historians and thinkers continue to grapple with, and it's a conversation worth having.
Absolutely. This deep dive has been a whirlwind of battles and strategies, and larger-than-life figures. But what I'll take away from it is the enduring power of the human spirit, the ability to stand up for what you believe in, even when the odds seem insurmountable. So to our listener, I encourage you to keep exploring this fascinating period of history. Read more about the Persian Wars, about the individuals who fought in them, and consider how those events, those choices, continue to shape our world today. Until next time.
Keep diving deep.